So just to indicate the mood that I'm hoping we can hit in the course, can you see the title of this astonishing book? This, as I say, is intended to set the mood. Okay. The title of this course is A 21st Century Semantic Recollection of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And I call it that because there's really two books that we're going to read. Most of Hegel's phenomenology, we're going to leave out some bits of it so as to get through it, and then A Spirit of Trust. And this is going to be equally a reading of those two books. And I'm going to say something about that more specifically further along. The most crucial thing is for you to look at the website. You will presumably already have done that, but that's where everything is. The readings are, and the syllabus is there. That's a work in progress. I'll keep adding things to that. So that's the place you should go to find out what's going on. So the title of this session, today's meeting, is Why Read Hegel Now? And how should we read it now? So I want to talk in those two points, roughly the two halves of the session. So it seems to me the story about why we should be reading Hegel starts, as most philosophical stories do, with Kant. He is, for us philosophers, what the poet Algernon Swinburne said the sea was, the great gray mother of us all. So we have to start with Kant. But I think there's a standing difficulty in reading Kant, a standing danger of losing sight of the forest for the trees. There's sort of so many trees in Kant that it's easy to lose sight of what the overall philosophical contributions that he's making are. So I want to talk about two of them that are particularly relevant to seeing what Hegel makes of him. I take it that these are points that Hegel emphasizes. They are, at any rate, the points that seem to me most important about Kant in order to understand the move on to Hegel. And the first of these is Kant's discovery of the normativity of intentionality. This, I think, is his axial thought, the thought around which everything else that Kant thought revolves. And this is the idea that what distinguishes knowers and agents from merely natural creatures isn't their involvement with or manifestation of some special kind of mind stuff. It's not an ontological distinction at all. It's that judgments and intentional doings are things that we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. They are, in the first instance, commitments of ours. They're exercises of a distinctive kind of authority. And these notions, responsibility, commitment, authority, these are all normative concepts. For Kant, what distinguishes us from it is deontological, not ontological. He reconceives and redescribes us as creatures who live and move and have our being in a normative space, a space articulated by our commitments, by our responsibilities, by the exercise of our authority. Now, it's no news that these normative notions loom large in his practical philosophy, but I'm claiming that they're the core of the theoretical philosophy as well. Where the tradition Kant inherited was interested in our grasp on ideas or concepts. Is it adequate? Is it clear? Is it distinct? Is it confused? For Kant, the question becomes how to understand the norms that we bind ourselves by, the rules that are concepts. The question is how to understand the grip they have on us, how we are bound by rules in the form of concepts, how it is that commitments get a grip on us. Paradigmatically, on the theoretical side, the kind of commitment one is undertaking in making a judgment. And what principally distinguishes discursive commitments is that at the core of what we're responsible for is having reasons for our judgments and our actions, our intentional actions, our theoretical commitments, and our practical commitments. So for Kant, these are all rational commitments, not in the sense that we always can justify them or have good reasons for them, but that it's always incumbent on us. It's always appropriate to ask us for our reasons. That's always a question that's in order. Now, this discovery, I want to say, of the normative character of intentionality was lost track of, I think, for something like the first half of the 20th century. The later Wittgenstein rediscovered it, not associating it with Kant, not particularly concerned, as Kant had been, with the status of knowledge. That was just one sort of intentional state. But Wittgenstein was interested in the sense in which discursiveness, having intentional states like belief, desire, intention, and so on, all should be understood ultimately in normative terms as a matter of something getting a grip on us, us committing ourselves. So in a characteristic Wittgensteinian anecdote, he imagines a guest in the house being asked by the children's mother, teach the children a game. And when she comes back a half an hour later, she sees the guest and the kids are all on their knees rolling dice for money. And she says, no, I didn't mean that kind of game. And Wittgenstein says, and she's right. What she says is perfectly true. She didn't mean that kind of game. But there was nothing in particular that went through her mind. She didn't have this mental reservation. Well, of course, don't teach them to gamble. Somehow the request she made instituted a norm for what would count as an appropriate response to that request, a response that fulfilled the request, that reached out, and even though playing craps is a game, the norm that she put in place by asking you to teach the children a game somehow reached out and excluded that. That was not an appropriate response. And Wittgenstein invites us to feel puzzled by that. He's interested in how that sort of normative bindingness is possible. And I'm going to say far more than Kant, Hegel is the one we have the most to learn from about the answer to that question. Sellers is someone who read Kant as having made this normative turn. Now, there's some subsidiary points in thinking about Kant that are immediately downstream from this insight into the normativity of intentionality. It's why for Kant, we see the primacy of the judgment, where the tradition he had inherited started with concepts and built up on that a doctrine of judgments, depending on how the concepts classified things, and then built on top of the doctrine of judgments, a doctrine of syllogisms. So it was a bottom-up form of explanation from the Port Royal logic up to Kant. And he says, no, you have to start with the judgment as the unit, and we're only going to understand concepts, what the tradition had started with, by dissecting judgments. We're going to understand them as a function of judgment. We're going to understand them in terms of the role they play in judgment. Why is that? It's because the judgment is the minimal unit of responsibility. It's the minimal unit you can take responsibility for. What sort of responsibility is it for Kant? Well, it's the responsibility to integrate it into a constellation of commitments that has the distinctive unity, the unity that's distinctive of apperception, the transcendental unity of apperception. That's what you have to do. That's what you're taking responsibility to do. Particularly important, I think, for Hegel is Kant, at least implicitly, has a normative account of representation. The genus that he used to bring together the intuitions, sensuous intuitions that the empiricists had been so concerned with, and the concepts that the rationalists had been so concerned with. Kant says the objective form of the judgment, the object equals X, that one is judging, thinking, or talking about. That's what one makes oneself responsible to when one becomes responsible for a judgeable content by an act of judging. One becomes responsible to this object in the sense it counts as what's represented by one's judgment, in that it sets a standard for the normative assessment of the correctness of the judgment in a distinctive sense. What it is to understand the judgment as a representing of some represented is to understand the represented as having a kind of authority over the representing, to understand the representing as being responsible for its correctness in a distinctive sense, to what counts as represented by it, just in virtue of being the standard, of setting the standard for assessments of correctness of the representing as a representing. So when Hegel reconceives Kantian normativity, ultimately in terms of social practices, one key element of that is going to be reconstruing the normative relation of representation. And this I see is at the center of Hegelian epistemology. Third, so downstream from the axial insight into the normative character of discursiveness, of intentionality, I've suggested the primacy of judgment, what we're responsible for, and a normative account of representation, which remains implicit and unexploited in Kant, but is the point d'appui where Hegel is going to take that idea and run with it. Third notion, and here's where we see an important hinge connecting the theoretical side of Kant's thought with the practical side. He starts with Rousseau's definition of freedom. And you'll remember that in Kant's famously sparse writing room, the only decoration is a picture of Rousseau, his hero. He starts with Rousseau's definition of freedom. Obedience to a law that one lays down for oneself is freedom, Rousseau says in The Social Contract. And Kant turns that saying around, treating it not as a definition of freedom, but as a criterion of demarcation for genuinely normative constraint. That is, he uses Rousseau's notion of obedience to a law one has laid down for oneself in order to understand the distinction between normative constraint and compulsion. Norms will be, for Kant, what provide reasons for other judgments and for actions. But what distinguishes constraint by norms, what distinguishes responsibility, commitment from causal constraint or constraint by power is that it's self-constrained. This is Kant's notion of autonomy, autos, self, and nomos, law. And the idea he takes over from Rousseau is that only we can bind ourselves in this normative sense. Only the bindings we impose on ourselves are normative bindings, being bound by a norm. And the result is what we can think of as the basic Kantian normative status, which is having the authority to make oneself responsible for a judgment on the theoretical side, or for a doing, endorsing a practical maxim on the practical side. The basic Kantian normative status is having the authority to commit oneself, to make oneself responsible by taking oneself to be responsible. And that's the authority that makes one a person, a subject. It's that authority that he talks about as the dignity of the Kantian subject, which others have a duty, an obligation, a responsibility, a commitment to respect, to acknowledge your authority, to make yourself responsible. And this is Kant's distinctive version of the Enlightenment idea that norms are instituted, normative statuses, paradigmatically responsibilities, commitments, are instituted by normative attitudes. This is an Enlightenment theme whose purest expression may be social contract theories of political obligation. Bibliographic note, if you look down at the supplementary readings that are linked to in the course website, you'll see the missing chapter of A Spirit of Trust, the chapter that didn't make it into the final cut, which is a breathless dash through early modern thought about normativity, picking out only the bits of it that really mattered to what Hegel made of this idea of Kant's, this autonomy idea. So in week 6, there's this available as supplemental material. Okay, so the first idea of big revolutionary idea of Kant's that in my reading orients Hegel's understanding of Kant is transposing traditional early modern philosophical questions and issues into a normative key, into a key where the notions of responsibility, of authority, of commitment are front and center, every bit as much in the theoretical sphere as in the practical sphere. Second big idea of Kant's, distinct from this insight into the normativity of intentionality, which, as I say, I think is a central concern of the later Wittgenstein, what distinguishes the later Wittgenstein from the early Wittgenstein. And this is Kant's idea that in addition to concepts whose principal expressive task is to describe and explain empirical happenings, there are concepts whose principal expressive task is to make explicit the framework of practices and abilities that makes it possible to describe and explain empirical happenings. These are framework explicating concepts. On the theoretical side, the original home of these concepts, the paradigm are alethic modal concepts that articulate subjunctive conditionals, the ones we use to express the law-likeness of connections that make it possible for us to reason with these connections, to rely on them in extracting consequences without worrying about whether the premises are true. These concepts, categorical concepts, articulate the inferential relations among empirical concepts, in virtue of which, as Sellers puts it, they can be used to describe and not merely to label. By labeling, he's thinking of us just differentially responding to things. More is involved in description. And the difference is that genuine descriptions stand in explanatory relations to one another. Relations of, what again, using a Sellarsian phrase, relations of be-causation of one to another. This description applies because this other description applies. And it's those explanations that exploit subjunctively robust inferential connections among descriptions. And Kant calls this new kind of concept that he's discovered pure categories of the understanding. And he takes our grasp of them to be a priori in the specific sense that there's no particular empirical concepts that one needs to know how to use in order to grasp these categorical concepts. In being able to use any empirical concept, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to apply these concepts. In that sense, they're implicit in the use of any empirical descriptive concepts. And part of this view is the view, then, that the explanatory relations that descriptive concepts stand into one another make an essential contribution to the content of those descriptions. And so this is a paradigm shift from the Humean picture, where Hume convinced himself he could fully understand the descriptive use of concepts and be completely clueless about the explanatory use of them. And Kant is building the reciprocal dependence of description and explanation into his notion of conceptual content. Okay, those are the two big Kantian ideas that I think it's worth having in view when we look to what's interesting about Hegel. And I think already one ought to be able to see and say, well, those are philosophically interesting ideas. You know, whether in the end we ought to think of concepts as rule-like, as setting down norms for judgment, for appropriate judgment, as determining what we've committed ourselves to when we apply an empirical concept, and what would entitle us to apply it, what would give us reasons for and against doing that. Whether in the end that should be the core of our understanding of concepts or not, that's a deep and important idea. We ought to figure out what there is to it. And in particular, for Kant, thinking about things that way, put at the center of the philosophical agenda understanding conceptual normativity, understanding the way in which we can bind ourselves by a concept, by applying it in judgment. What kind of a grip does it have on us? This, for him, was the question of the validity of our concept use. The Verbindlichkeit, the bindingness, the Gültigkeit, the validity of it, that becomes the most urgent philosophical topic. And the categorical concepts redefine epistemology. If you want to understand our capacity to know how things empirically are, if you want to understand our use of ground level empirical concepts, and there's an analog for our use of ground level practical concepts, if you want to understand them, you better have a story about the categorical concepts that make explicit the presuppositions of being able to make judgments and endorse practical maxims. Okay, let me stop there before I shift gears and say something about what Hegel made of these ideas, or what the subsequent tradition did. I'm articulating the Cartesian, the Kantian forest here. That's what I claim by trying to pick out the big revolutionary lessons we should learn from him, or moves that he made. Are there comments or questions at this point? Okay, well, I'm going to plunge on, and I admit it's sort of hard to know what to say about something at the level of abstraction that I'm talking about it. Let me jump past Hegel. I'll come back to him, to the Neo-Kantian tradition in Germany in the 19th century. Because these are the people who didn't lose track of the two big Kantian ideas that I've talked about, who understood Kant as having instituted a normative revolution in rejecting the style of epistemology that, as he puts it, the celebrated Mr. Locke had pursued, which actually was a mere physiology of the understanding, which didn't ask the question of justification, the quid juris question. So the founder of the Neo-Kantian tradition, the one who famously said, we have to go zurück nach Kant, back to Kant, was Kuno Fischer, who was a professor in Göttingen, was Frege's teacher. What Frege learned about Kant, he learned from Kuno Fischer. Fischer's the one who reconstrued Kant as a philosopher of science and advised that we read Kant through what he made of natural science. But usually when people talk about the Neo-Kantians, they're talking about the next generation of them. Maybe this was set in motion. Fischer had a famous debate with the philosopher Trendelenburg about Kantian minutiae, and the next generation of Neo-Kantians cut their teeth on sort of adjudicating this battle between the giants of the previous generation, Fischer and Trendelenburg. So there were two schools, the Marburg Neo-Kantians, Hermann Cohen and younger Paul Nator, who were closer to Fischer and focused on the natural sciences and Kantian lessons from there. And in Freiburg, usually called the Southwest Neo-Kantians, Wilhelm Windelband and the younger Heinrich Rickert focused more on social sciences and history. I'll just mention Rickert, maybe, anyway, I find him substantially less interesting than Cohen and Windelband and even than Nathorp. He seems to me the weak one of all of these, but he was Heidegger's Doktorvater. He was the Doktorvater of Bruno Bauch, who was Frege's colleague in Jena and was Carnap's Doktorvater. So his children and grandchildren academically are really important. Maybe he was a teacher rather than a writer. And in the next generation, I think canonically thought of as the last generation of Neo-Kantians, Ernst Cassirer would be named. I actually think the Neo-Kantian tradition continued with C.I. Lewis and Carnap, and then on to Sellers. But that's not the way things are normally thought of. These Neo-Kantians are important because they did see Kant's normative turn. They saw him as having made things new, in particular made epistemology new, by thinking about the quid juris, the question of justification, and seeing that that was a different kind of question than the question about correctness of representation. They saw, as Fischer had, Kant as teaching philosophers to be concerned with what knowledge is as such. It's a Neo-Kantian thought that Stanley Cavell expressed when in a characteristic one-sentence description of the history of philosophy in this period. He said, Kant depsychologized epistemology. Frege depsychologized logic. And Wittgenstein depsychologized psychology. In each case, the depsychologization is appreciating the normative dimension. Logic as a normative science for Frege, and Wittgenstein seeing not just epistemology, but the philosophy of mind as normative, seeing sapience as a normative phenomenon generally. And this is certainly the tradition I think Hegel belongs in. But interestingly, these Neo-Kantians, who particularly, I think, Cohen, get very close to the Hegelian version of these Kantian ideas. But they're convinced that their thought about normativity has nothing to do with Hegel. They don't see Hegel as having anything to say about normativity. They don't see him as following up on this aspect of Kant that they particularly appreciated. The story about Hegel, who had left no first-rate students who cared about his logic and his metaphysics. All his good students cared about his social and political philosophy. And the caricature that they had, the Neo-Kantians had, of Hegel forbade them from seeing themselves as developing lines of thought that were already in Hegel. And this was to their detriment, because Neo-Kantianism oscillated between reductionism about discursive normativity and dualism, a dualism that put a norm-fact dualism in the place of the old Cartesian mind-body dualism. Now, the way I use the term, a dualism is what a distinction becomes when it's drawn in terms that make the relations between the distinguished items unintelligible. That's why Descartes' substance dualism, insofar as the distinction between thinking things and extended things, between things that are by nature representings and things that by nature can only be represented, insofar as we can't tell a story about how to understand those as related to one another, that becomes a dualism. And Fred Beiser, for instance, who's one of the relatively few people in English who has written about the Neo-Kantians, I think correctly sees that the Neo-Kantians did not find the conceptual resources to both emphasize Kant's normative insight and apply it, and avoid a norm-fact or norm-cause dualism. Falling into that dualism or recoiling from it with a reductionism that undercut the distinction, that was the rock on which Neo-Kantianism foundered. And I will say that, though, I mentioned a minute ago that I think of Carnap, Rickard's student, and C.I. Lewis as continuing the Neo-Kantian tradition. Normativity is not an issue for either of them. It's not at the center of epistemology, at the center of logic. Carnap would have said logic is a normative science following Frege, but he didn't worry about the nature of logical normativity in the way in which the Neo-Kantians had. Sellers, a student of Carnap and C.I. Lewis, he did, because he was a student of Kant in a sense in which Carnap was not. So I think that failure, intellectual failure, philosophical failure of German 19th century Neo-Kantianism to develop a notion of discursive normativity that could do the work that they properly saw Kant had suggested it could do. Their failure to find a notion that wasn't either dualistic, making too sharp a distinction where the relations ultimately become unintelligible, or falling back into a naturalistic reductionism. I mean, to a first approximation, it was the Freiburg folks who were dualists and the Marburg folks who were reductionists, but they, I think, all oscillated here. I claim that had they been able to read Hegel as one of them, as addressing the challenge that these generations of Neo-Kantians had, they could have avoided being the sort of intellectual evolutionary dead end that in many ways they have been. So Hegel. Here too, I want to say two large moves. I mean, this is going to be at the same level of hand-wavy abstractions, 10,000 feet, the view from 10,000 feet up that I was giving of Kant. Next week, I'm going to present an overview of my more detailed reading of Hegel. What I'm going to say today, I think, is less idiosyncratic than what I'll be talking about next week. Pretty much everybody has some version of the points that I'm going to make, though traditional readers of Hegel don't give them the emphasis that I would. So the first big idea that Hegel has downstream from these Kantian ones is giving a social account of normativity. Where Kant had thought about normativity in terms of autonomy, there were social relations in Kant. The authority that is autonomy, the authority to commit yourself, is a dignity that other autonomous creatures are obliged to respect. But he didn't think of that respect as constitutive of the authority. The social relation of respect for the dignity of other autonomous creatures, that's not of the essence of autonomy. It's a fact downstream from it. Hegel has the idea that normative statuses are essentially social statuses. Norms are instituted for him by reciprocal recognition. Recognizing somebody is his version of Kantian respect, acknowledgement of the authority of another to commit themselves, of their being the subject of normative statuses. But now Hegel says there isn't really a normative status unless you're recognized as having it by those you recognize. To be a normative subject is to be recognized as such by those you recognize as such. The authority to commit yourself, to make yourself responsible, the dignity and autonomy that is the basic Kantian normative status depends on its being respected, attributed, recognized by others. Insofar as it's not, it's defective. It's not an actual normative status. His account of the master-slave dialectic is his analysis of what happens when the recognition is not reciprocal, it's not mutual recognition, the kind of defect that there is. He identifies that with a a subordination obedience structure of normativity, and wants to argue it's defective. A Hegelian slogan, though he never actually says this, relative to Kant, is that all transcendental constitution is social institution. We have to understand norms in terms of the structure of the social practices of a community. And I think there's a direct connection, intellectually, not one of influence, as far as I know, between this view and the later Wittgenstein's view about what it is that makes a signpost more than merely a piece of wood. It's being caught up in customs, uses, institutions, practices, and so on. But Hegel has a systematic metaphysics of the institution, of normative statuses by normative attitudes, how it is that where Kant thought I could make myself responsible just by taking myself to be responsible, that it was a basic fact about me, that I had the authority to commit myself. Hegel sees that as a social achievement, as not something I can do all by myself. That depends on its being acknowledged by others who will hold me responsible for what I have undertaken responsibility for. And a remarkable consequence of this social view of social metaphysics of normativity is Hegel's notion of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is the essence of selfhood, of being a normative subject. And for him, it's an essentially social achievement. To be self-conscious is to have a normative status that's a social status. Self-consciousness is not something that happens between somebody's ears. It's something that happens between the members of a community. Now, Kant had famously taken consciousness to presuppose self-consciousness. Hegel's version of this is that being able to commit yourself in judgment or intentional action depends both on your acknowledging that commitment and your commitment being acknowledged by others, being attributed to you. Your status as committed, as responsible, is attitude dependent. But unlike Kant, it's not just dependent on your attitudes, it's dependent on the attitudes of others whom you recognize in the sense of granting them the authority to hold you responsible for the commitments you've undertaken. And there's a distinctive structure of authority and responsibility here. It's entirely up to you who you grant this authority to, who you recognize. But then it's not up to you, at least in the same sense, whether they recognize you, whether they, in holding you responsible, take you to have the status that you have, as it were, petitioned them to acknowledge you as having. And I sometimes think it's helpful in this way to think not about sort of the overall normative status of being a subject of commitments and responsibilities at all, but a much lighter weight sort of normative status of, say, being a good chess player. And the picture is, well, if you aspire to be a good chess player, it's up to you what you mean by that. You could set the standard so low that anybody who can play a legal game is somebody you would recognize as a good chess player, or only formidable club players, or maybe only masters or grandmasters. That's up to you. Setting the standard of good chess players with respect to which you aspire to be one. That's a matter of who you recognize as a good chess player in that sense. But then to actually be a good chess player in that sense, you have to be recognized as such by the ones you recognize as such. And that's not just a matter of your attitudes. It's a matter of the practices and what you need to do to earn that recognition. And I think, at that level, thinking about being a good philosopher or a good writer, maybe things we care more about than chess, arguably has the same structure of responsibility and authority. At any rate, Hegel in the Phenomenology is going to obsess about this idea, about the idea of genuine authority and responsibility as instituted by attitudes of taking or treating oneself or others as responsible or authoritative, when those attitudes have the right social structure, namely when they're mutual or reciprocal recognition, and that they're distinctive kinds of pathologies, normative pathologies, that come about when recognitive relations are asymmetric, as they are in the case of the master and the slave, where the master doesn't accept that the slave's recognition can have any constitutive effect on him. He doesn't recognize the slave, and yet is what he is what he identifies as the master, only insofar as he's taken to be the master by the slave. He's actually constituted by the recognition whose authority he officially doesn't acknowledge. And this is a theme in Hegel that was obviously really important to Marx and to Nietzsche. It really wasn't, I think, until Kojève's Hegel seminars after the Second World War that we came to sort of see this as a central theme in the Phenomenology to recover this. Okay, that social idea is one. And I'm going to be saying throughout, I'm going to be claiming throughout the course that we should think of Hegel and the later Wittgenstein as having a common topic and common intuitions about it, a common approach to it, modulo the substantial difference that Hegel is a systematic metaphysician, and Wittgenstein thinks that's the last thing we should be doing. And whether in the end you want to endorse the sort of social metaphysics of normativity that Hegel has or not, the compare and contrast with the later Wittgenstein, I think, is a fruitful one. The second big move that Hegel famously makes is a historical one. Taking the categorical concepts that Kant had discovered or invented as things that have a history, as things that change from one epoch to another. I think most people who read, at any rate, the Hegel of the Phenomenology appreciate that. I don't think it's commonly appreciated what the connection is between normativity and the discovery of the historicity of normativity. Hegel's idea is that normative creatures ones that live and move and have their being in a normative space, don't have natures. They have histories instead. And that's because their normative statuses essentially depend on their normative attitudes. In Kant, one can't be committed apart from taking oneself to be committed. As he says, where natural creatures are subject to laws, rules that don't depend on the attitudes of the ones bound by them, we're bound by our representations of rules, bound by laws that we've acknowledged the authority of. Essentially, self-conscious creatures are ones such that what they are, in a bit of Hegelian jargon, what they are for themselves, their attitudes, are an essential element of what they are in themselves, their statuses. It's these attitudes of reciprocal recognition, not just what I am for myself, but what I am for you and you are for me. That is the commitments that I attribute as well as the ones I undertake. But what we are in ourselves, our normative statuses, essentially depend on these normative attitudes. For Hegel, these recognitive attitudes. And that means that we're subject to a distinctive kind of development. We can change what we are in ourselves by changing what we are for ourselves, which is not to say that we sort of automatically become in ourselves what we are for ourselves, just that what we are in ourselves essentially depends on what we are for ourselves, our normative statuses on our normative attitudes. So he's interested in a form of understanding of normative creatures that understands the constellation of statuses and attitudes that they have as the product of a developmental cascade that has this distinctive structure, changing the statuses by changing the attitudes then changing in response to the change of the statuses, and so on. For creatures like us, he thinks, for normative creatures, to know what they are, you have to rehearse how they got that way. What was the process of alteration of attitude, alteration of status, leading to alteration of attitudes? And so he wants to say atoms have a nature, but the concept of an atom has a history, reflecting the historical nature of the creatures who use them. This is the fundamental difference between the Naturwissenschaft and the sciences that study things that have natures, and the Geisteswissenschaft, the sciences that study things that have histories rather than natures, normative beings. And his idea is that you have to understand these normative creatures in a distinctive way. And this is what, in the second half of today's session, I want to talk about under the heading of hermeneutic understanding. How do you read texts? But Hegel thinks that there's a distinctive way of understanding norm-governed creatures in their statuses and attitudes, a distinctive kind of self-consciousness and self-understanding that is recollection, Erinnerung, which is a kind of rationality, a retrospective, rational reconstruction of a history of the development of the process, that a rehearsal of the process that brought you to where you are now. This recollective rationality retrospective rational reconstruction. He says that's what turns a past into a history. And in another slogan, he's going to say this kind of recollective understanding is what makes something that merely happens into something done. And the core of the phenomenology is the reason chapter. That's his account of practical rationality, of intentional agency. Reason, he says, is practical agency. And that's what he means by reason. That's where he's going to tell us how a recollective rational reconstruction of what's happened can not only turn a past into a history, but turn what happens into something done. And that recollective form of rationality, for him, it's a form of reason's march through history. It's what makes things rational. It's the distinctive kind of taking things to be rational that actually makes them rational. And this is one of his big ideas, this essentially historical form of rationality, recollective rationality. And it's the key to his appreciating the distinction between things that have natures and things that have histories, but not in a dualistic way, in a way where we can understand the relations between what merely happens and what's done, the past and a history of the past. It's the form of his historical metaphysics of normativity. And it involves what is recognizably another version of the social recognitive structure of authority and responsibility. But now the authority of the present and the future over the past, balanced by the authority of the past over the present and the future, in a way that has the same sort of reciprocal recognitive structure of authority and responsibility that sort of horizontal social relations do. That's the challenge of the metaphysics of normativity in the phenomenology, is to make sense of that. So I said he's going to give us a social account of the institution of norms. He's going to give a historical account of a distinctive kind of rationality, a kind of rationalizing that makes rational, makes intelligible. And the third aspect of what he makes of that Kantian notion of normativity is that normativity itself has a history. His term for all of our norm-governed doings and institutions is Geist, spirit. That's the normative space in which we, as I've said, live and move and have our being. Geist has a structure. It's a normative structure, and it changes from one epoch to another. And in particular, the one biggest thing that's ever happened in human history, the biggest thing that's ever happened to us, for Hegel, is the vast, rolling, still incomplete sea change between traditional structures of normativity and modern ones, distinctively modern ones. Now, all the Enlightenment philosophers from Descartes through Kant were theorists of modernity, in the sense that they were giving us the fighting faith of enlightenment, the intellectual tools to understand the rise of the new science, which was the sort of intellectual aspect of modernity. But Hegel was the first philosopher to see modernity whole, not just the Enlightenment and the rise of science, but to see why that and the rise of political liberalism were two sides of one coin, to see the rise of capitalism in economics as an aspect of that same change in the underlying structure of normativity, to see literary changes only come to full fruition after him, but such as the rise of the novel, as all part and parcel of one change. That was a change in the structure of normativity from traditional subordination obedience models, whose paradigm is the great chain of being, the scala natura, which is a chain of superiority and subordination that has, in its Christianized form, God at the top and kings and popes below it, reaching all the way down through chains of nobility to peasants, but also continued into the inanimate. Inanimate world is the reason we have dominion over the beasts and the beasts over the plants, so on. And that structure of normativity and the form of self-consciousness that went with it, the form of self-consciousness epitomized in the title of F.H. Bradley's essay, My Station and Its Duties, that's transformed into a distinctively modern, subjective form of self-consciousness. And Hegel is the first one to take that event as a topic of central philosophical importance. And I think to this day, the big sociological divide within philosophy as a discipline, what has been theorized about as an analytic-continental split, the genuine sociological fact is there's a division between philosophers who agree with Hegel that the advent of modernity is a central philosophical issue, that should be something we theorize about, no less than it is the central defining problem of the new 19th century discipline of sociology, whose founding job was to understand the advent of modernity, and political theory was transformed equally. Do you take modernity to be a basic philosophical issue, concern, or problem, or not? Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche do. Husserl and Heidegger, Foucault and Derrida do. Frege, Russell, Carnap, Quine, no. The rise of science, yes, but not modernity as a phenomenon that the rise of science and indeed the Enlightenment was only one aspect of, was the theory, as it were. And as I read Hegel, he thinks that if we properly understand what happened to normativity when it came to take a modern form rather than a traditional form, and we see what was progressive about that, and we also see the apple in that worm, that alienation from our norms, the sense in which the status dependence of our normative attitudes goes missing, the sense in which the bindingness, the practical bindingness of our normative statuses becomes unintelligible to us. That's what he calls alienation. That's the worm in the apple of modernity. But he thinks once we properly understand that, we'll see what's required for a third phase in the history of humanity and the history of Geist. And the frighteningly titled final chapter of the Phenomenology, Absolute Knowing, Absolutism, that's the theoretical expression of the self-consciousness which will not institute postmodern normativity until we've restructured our recognitive relations in the light of it, but which is the understanding of what will happen when that does, what's required for that third phase. So this concludes my answer to the question, why read Hegel now? Well, we ought to decide whether he's right, that modernity is this problem that we should be worrying about, and what is there to be said for his view about the promised land that he can bring us within sight of, even though we can't enter it. So, I think this is a fascinating constellation of ideas, and my own particular interest is in the theory of conceptual content that Hegel systematically develops here as a response to some of the issues that later Wittgenstein sensitized us to, as a way forward from Kant's insight into the normativity of discursiveness, of intentionality, that might help us get off this oscillation between a reductionism that doesn't give due weight to due appreciation to what's distinctive about the normative realm, on the one hand, and a dualistic failure to integrate that picture of norms into what we know about the natural world, the world of things that have natures, not histories. So I think Hegel's constructive response to all this is at least a colorable response, and it ought to be part of the contemporary conversation as such. So I said very little about how that actually goes. I'll say some more about how I think it goes next time. Okay, well, I propose then that we take our break, and when we come back from the break, I'll talk about reading texts, in particular, reading texts of the mighty philosophical dead, Hegel, and what's distinctive of the way I think about how one should do that. So why don't we take 15 minutes and come back just at 3. I said at the beginning that the presentation would be in 2 parts, one of them addressing the question, why read Hegel now? And the second addressing the question of how we ought to do that. I want to say some general things about readings. This is a question of hermeneutics, of the interpretation of texts. And I realize this isn't a familiar tradition to many of you. Rorty said that he used to address analytic audiences about the topic of hermeneutics without realizing how many of the people in the audience thought that he was talking about a German philosopher whose first name was Hermann and whose last name they didn't quite catch. And so I don't know, I don't assume this is an audience like that, but hermeneutics as the systematic study of the reading of texts started off as a subdiscipline of theology. It was about Bible interpretation. But within modern philosophy, Spinoza, with his source critique of the Bible, Kant in Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone, maybe bookending the Enlightenment treatment of this, and then the Romantics, Hegel's contemporaries in Jena, starting with Herder, but among his contemporaries, all three Schlegels, who were had only recently left Jena when he was writing the Phenomenology. And then in the 19th century, I think for the first part of it, Schleiermacher was the one who was developing the hermeneutic program, and in the second half, Dilthey. But the discipline within philosophy was really crystallized retrospectively by Gadamer's 1960 Wahrheit und Methode, Truth and Method, which is locus classicus, telling us the history of hermeneutic understanding and really retrospectively defining this tradition in philosophy. At the same time, he took it a decisive step forward. And I think hermeneutic issues are going to be with us throughout the course, because what I'm presenting is a reading of the phenomenology of spirit. And we're really going to be going back and forth between these two big books, Phenomenology and A Spirit of Trust. And the relation between them is constantly going to be an issue. Furthermore, my hermeneutic practice is both unusual and non-trivially controversial. And I don't want to pretend otherwise. But I am unusually theoretically explicit about the rationale for my hermeneutic practices. And it was with that in mind that I suggested you read in preparation for today my methodological essay on hermeneutic practices and theories of meaning, and two essays, one by Dave Marshall, who's an intellectual historian, my colleague at Pitt in the communications department, and another by Kenneth Harrelson, a philosopher, talking specifically about philosophical historiography and making the case that there is something to be learned about hermeneutic practice from philosophy of language the way I practice it, that is, from a specifically inferentialist perspective. And we're going to see that the way I read Hegel is informed, on the one hand, by details of my reading of Hegel, in particular, his invention of recollective rationality, this kind of retrospective rational reconstruction of a tradition as the form of an understanding that takes you to the next step in that retroactively constituted tradition, on the one hand, and my understanding of conceptual contents as inferential roles, on the other hand, coming from the philosophy of language. Now, one place to think about this is an orienting story that used to be told to prospective graduate students at Pitt, and for all I know, it still is, about the way various faculty members approach reading The Mighty Dead. Referring to my colleague, Steve Engstrom, the distinguished Kant scholar and practical philosopher, they said, you have to understand that Engstrom is a unit of hermeneutic distance. it's defined as the least possible distance between a text and a reading, so a reading can count as an interpretation of the text. And the Brandom is another unit of hermeneutic distance, defined as the greatest possible distance between a text and a reading, at which the reading counts as an interpretation of that text. Now, this wouldn't be a joke unless there were a lot of truth to it. And I think I can show you. This is the worry, I would say, about the kind of hermeneutic practice that I engage in, that the ratio of Brandom to Hegel in my readings is so high that the original text is playing this role in the reconstruction. Now, I do want to defend myself against this, but I don't want to deny that there's a genuine danger within the hermeneutic tradition, taking the concept over from rhetoric. The thing to be avoided is catachresis, doing violence to the text by reading it in a way that doesn't respect some aspects of its fundamental integrity. And there really is such a thing as textual ventriloquism, when the author's lips move, but the only voice you can really hear is that of the interpreter. And that's a bad hermeneutic practice. I actually have in my Hegel lectures sometimes used a little Hegel puppet and actually spoken with him. Maybe later on you'll see that, but characterizing what's wrong with even evidently bad hermeneutic practices isn't as easy as you might think. One index figure here outside philosophy, but I think an important one for this, is the literary critic Harold Bloom. One of his books was A Map of Misreading, which is about, he's elaborating a distinction between weak and strong readings. And he's in favor of strong readings of the Mighty Dead. But his thesis is that every sufficiently strong reading is a misreading. That's what teaches us about texts, or anyway, there's a distinctive kind of thing that we're taught about them by strong readings that are misreadings. My own version of that is that every sufficiently serious reading is a rewriting of the text. It is a re-understanding of it in a way that, when systematized, would take the form of rewriting the original text. And the question is, if there's some point to doing that, what are the rules? What are the aims with which one does it? What norms govern assessments of the success of that kind of enterprise? I mean, I think it's important not to underestimate the things you can legitimately do to a historical text, to a philosophical text in particular. I think about the modernist painter Jasper John's characterization of his artistic process. He says, well, I take an object and I do something to it and I look at it, and then I do something else to it and I look at it again. And I continue that until either there's something really interesting there or I have to throw it away and start over. Now, valuable things can come out of a practice like that, including if the object one starts with is a text of the Mighty Dead. But I don't think things are so simple as is suggested by the metaphor of hermeneutic distance between a text and an interpretation. I mean, I can imagine following up sort of the initial joke by saying defensively, look, I aim to keep my reading of this passage to within 2 or at most 3 angstroms of it. Or on the other hand, look, I'm only venturing a half Brandom away from the text here, but clearly something has gone wrong if we ask, well, how many angstroms are there in a Brandom? How many does it take to get there? And I think the picture that's behind that distance metaphor is a Lockean picture of communication that's in the background, that thinks of meaning as some kind of gemstone in the mind of the author, fixed and complete in all its particulars, and that communication succeeds when an exact duplicate of that gem is somehow engendered in the mind of the audience. But look, that's a terrible picture of meaning. It's the one Quine talked about under the head of the myth of the museum there. And I think one way to begin to see the flaws in the context of the hermeneutic interpretation of texts is to think about Jorge Luis Borges' story about Pierre Menard. Pierre Menard, in the early 20th century, rewrote as his masterwork, his greatest novel, Don Quixote, word for word and sentence for sentence, identically. And yet the critics were bowled over by the novelty of this work, by the boldness of this novel published in the first third of the 20th century. The sentences Menard writes now have completely different meanings from those written in 1605, even though the words are the same. In Borges' story, this was heralded as a great original novel. And I think about, in an example of literary people sometimes use, in the 18th century, the poet Mark Akenside described creation with the line, "And the creator raised his plastic arm." Well, that's sort of humorous now. We wouldn't write it that way. The word has come to mean something other than what it did there. Tradition and context alters the meanings that are expressed by words and sentences. One of the pieces I put in the website for today is an untimely review of the Phenomenology that I wrote for the journal Topoi. This is an institution they have where the literary conceit is that one is to review some great work of in the history of philosophy as though it had just been published. Plato's Republic or Wittgenstein's Investigations. And the point is not only to give us fresh eyes on the text being recontextualized. It's not just to poke fun at the conventions of contemporary academic publishing and reviewing, but to emphasize how different some of the claims of whatever text one is looking at would be if someone were putting them forward today. T.S. Eliot, who you may remember finished writing his PhD dissertation in philosophy at Harvard in 1916, in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, wrote, "What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the really new, work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, and values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new." Well, he's talking about the way in which what happens after a text is produced can legitimately affect the meaning of it. If it's a philosophical text, I think what we care about is the conceptual content of it. And what ought to guide our hermeneutic practice then is our understanding of concepts. And I understand concepts as inferential roles, as at least determining inferential roles. Your understanding of something somebody says is a matter of your knowing what would follow from it, and what would be evidence for it or against it. And I've suggested that context, historical context, a tradition might be important for that. This is supposed to soften you up for thinking about the meaning that's expressed by some stretch of text in holistic terms. And we could start by thinking about a holism claim that Quine famously makes in Two Dogmas of Empiricism. At least one way of boiling it down, it goes like this. The meaning of a sentence must at least determine its inferential role. That's the role it plays as a premise or a conclusion in reasoning, a matter of what it's a reason for and what would be a reason for and against, and what would be a reason for and against it. Second claim, but what follows from a claim, a claimable, depends on what other claims are used as auxiliary hypotheses or conjoined with it as collateral premises. Quine called this the Duhem point. And he concludes, third claim, so we can only consider the meaning expressed by a sentence in the context of other claims to which we're committed, which provide the inferential evidential context in which its consequences are extracted and its antecedents are elaborated. Quine puts this schematically by saying the smallest unit of meaning should accordingly be understood to be theories, not sentences. Well, I think this idea of Quine's, the way I put it here, I think this is generally correct. It's one way into what I've called inferentialist approaches to meaning. Both Quine's and Sellers' criticisms of empiricism in Two Dogmas and in Empiricism, the Philosophy of Mind, turn on rejecting its semantic atomism, focusing on the role played by empirical claims in reasoning. So, particularly in the case of philosophical claims and theories, what we're principally interested in, understanding them, is extracting a conceptual role, an inferential role from them. And the question becomes then, well, what's the context? Where should we draw our auxiliary hypotheses from? But the essence of the inferentialist approach to meaning is to say, well, you should think of the meaning as something like a function from contexts to inferential significance that it has. It's part of the meaning that, well, if you combine it with these premises, it would entail this. If you combine it with these other premises, this would count as evidence for this claim, and so on. From a semantic point of view, every context that you could conjoin it with gives you a legitimate perspective on the meaning. It's an argument that that function can apply to. Now, that's not to say that these are all equally interesting, but they're all equally legitimate perspectives on the meaning. So, which contexts would be particularly important? Well, one context is other claims that the author makes. This is what I call, well, this is the rules for de dicto ascription of propositional attitudes. When, if I'm going to report what you said or thought, and I don't do it by direct quotation, if I say, you said that, so John said a rational wolf would be able to let his mind roam over possibilities of behavior other than what comes naturally to wolves. I can say that with a quote, or I can paraphrase it. But the rule of the paraphrase is it ought to be something that the author I'm attributing it to would expect, would agree to, would accept. And that means, in effect, using as the context just other claims that the author endorses. But that's not the only kind of belief ascription. Henry Adams was a famous participant in the culture war between Boston and Philadelphia and denied that any Philadelphian could have invented the lightning rod. Now, he presumably knew perfectly well that Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod and was in fact a Philadelphian, but we could legitimately report the content of his claim that he claimed of Benjamin Franklin, a Philadelphian, that he did not invent the lightning rod. Because that follows from what he said, given something else that's true, namely that Franklin invented the lightning rod. That's a de re characterization of his belief. It's not attributing a different content to it than the de dicto ascription does. It's just specifying it from a different perspective by conjoining it not with other claims that the author has endorsed or would endorse, but rather by conjoining it with claims that the interpreter would endorse, claims that the interpreter takes to be true. Now, in the David Marshall essay, you will see a discussion of this distinction between de dicto and de re interpretation. Those are my terms for it. In intellectual historiography, with the main move having been made by Quentin Skinner, Cambridge intellectual historian in the middle 60s, arguing for what's come to be called a contextualist reading of the Mighty Dead, that appeals only to claims that they would have made themselves, as opposed to what he calls disparagingly presentism, which is reading the Mighty Dead through the lens of the concerns and considerations of the present interpreter. Now, I do think it's worth pointing out that it's not entirely straightforward how to apply the de dicto rules, the contextualist rules, in the case of, say, the phenomenology. The author, Hegel, did say a lot of things in the science of logic. Those are claims that he endorsed, that then him endorsed. Are those legitimate to use in conjunction with the black letter sentences that appear in the phenomenology? Many people believe that Hegel changed his mind about what book he was writing in the middle of the phenomenology, that he set out to write the book under the original title, The Science of the Experience of Consciousness, and that he finished that book with the reason chapter, and that everything comes after that is a book he decided to append to it when he'd gotten that far. Now, that's a topic I'll talk about sort of when it comes around in the phenomenology. The short version is, on Hegel's view of intention, he cannot have written a book other than the book he originally intended to write. So he's at least committed to that being the book that he always, from the beginning, intended to write. But even within the words actually penned by one author, we come to question about how narrowly or widely to draw our context. And Foucault's notorious assertion of the death of the author is a dramatic way of urging that we should no longer accord unique normative privilege to what he called discourse segmented according to signatures. That is, we shouldn't accord a unique normative privilege in the reading of a text to other sentences that came out of the same pen or words that came out of the same mouth, works or portion of works or text produced by multiple authors in a genre. Foucault is famous for having written about 19th century Parisian police reports that were written by hundreds of different policemen, but persuades us by the end that treating their total production as a single text to be read pays many benefits from it, even though there is no single signature that goes with it. I said that for an inferentialist, we think, well, every context of collateral premises gives a legitimate perspective on the meaning expressed by a sentence. But you might think that there is a natural privileging of a context. After all, we want to know what follows from the claim that's made there. What is it a reason for? What is evidence for it? Or would be evidence against it? Well, conjoin it with other true claims. Why do we care what follows from it if you conjoin it with false claims? If you want to know what really follows from it, you should look at what's true. Henry Adams claimed of Ben Franklin that he could not have invented the lightning rod. And this is the impulse behind what Skinner calls presentist readings. A paradigm would be Bertrand Russell reading some of Plato's dialogues and saying, well, we now know, as poor Plato did not, that there's a distinction when he's talking about parts and wholes between the subset relation and the element of relation. Now, that licenses us, Russell thought, to go through and ask which of his arguments would go through if by part and whole he meant subset of a set or meant element of a set. And we today might think, oh, and poor benighted Russell didn't realize there was a mereological sense, and we should ask about that too. What Russell was concerned was not sort of which one did he mean, but did he shift meanings in the middle of an argument? That's what Skinner is objecting to, is that sort of presentism, bringing things we take to be true, there are these distinctions, and using them to interrogate the text or to extract its meaning. And my view is the De Re readings, the De Dicto readings, what I'll call interpretation de traditione, that lets you bring in other claims from the same tradition, even the same retrospectively, recollectively instituted tradition. That's another context that can illuminate the meaning of the text, that can provide a legitimate perspective on it. The key thing is just to be absolutely clear in your own mind and explicit about what kind of interpretation you're giving, what the rules are for the game that you're playing. When are you extracting a consequence because it follows from the claim one is assessing, when it's conjoined with other things that you've drawn, other claims you've drawn from the same text? And when is it that you're importing something that you're not attributing responsibility to the author for, but undertaking responsibility, but saying, because this is true, this collateral claim is true, look at what actually follows from what the author has been saying. Well, I think that one is licensed in reading Hegel in a de re, a de traditione way, because that's the way Hegel read his predecessors, Hegel, writing in the first generation of moderns who really did intellectual history. It was these principally Germans around 1800 who made intellectual history into something like a modern discipline. They're looking back at Herder, but recollectively, rationally reconstructing the meaning of the text. That's a Hegelian reading of Hegel. It's the way he reads his predecessors. Hegel says when he reads Kant, he aims to understand Kant better than Kant understood himself. And this is what he means by it, that his recollective understanding of it that is going to appeal to things that happened after Kant and to arguments that Kant didn't make, but Hegel does, that this can be a way of understanding Kant better than Kant understood himself. And Hegel always insists that Hegel is the true Kantian, following out what really followed from the claims that Kant makes, as opposed to the things that Kant thought he did. So Hegel not only practices this kind of hermeneutics, he is maybe the most important theorist of what he's doing in reading his predecessors. So one of the things I'll be trying to elicit from his text is this deep philosophical, indeed metaphysical, warrant for a kind of hermeneutic practice. Hegel gives us a theory of conceptual content, according to which there is no fact of the matter about the meaning of a claim, apart from some recollective rational reconstruction of it, only from the perspective of such a recollection of it, does it have any determinate meaning at all. So if and insofar as I can make out that claim, at least that will give us a standard for assessing readings of this text of the Mighty Dead, and maybe warrant the claim that Hegel himself has given us permission to do that. So next time you'll get a heaping portion of such readings, because I mean in the session next time to give you an overview of what I think goes on in different parts of the phenomenology, and sort of much closer to the philosophical ground, if not to the textual ground, in the particular contours of my reading of the philosophical view that I attribute to him. One of the resources so one of the things I want you to understand, aside from understanding Hegel in the Phenomenology, is my reading of Hegel in a spirit of trust. And one of the resources that I've made available in the website is the text and video of 18 lectures that I've given, the Humboldt lectures in Leipzig, sort of walking through the phenomenology, reading it as I do. You have the video of those, you have the text of those, and in the most compressed form, you have the handouts for the text of those, which is a sort of abstract of how I'm reading the introduction, how I'm reading the consciousness chapters, how I'm reading reason, and so on. But maybe halfway through this Ringvorlesung, the series of lectures, that were given over a number of years, let's say 18 lectures. I was sitting there when one of the German graduate students asked my host, Pirmin Steckler-Weithofer, he said, I'm writing my dissertation on Hegel, on the Phenomenology. I believe I know the text well. Brandom says all these interesting things, but I can't see the relation between what Brandom is saying and what I find in Hegel. He might as well be talking about a different book. And Weithofer said, think about it this way. You're hearing the views of a deep and important philosopher. Let's call him Hegel. And your job is to understand that philosopher and what he has to teach you about the ground level philosophical topics that he's addressing, let's say the nature of conceptual content. When you get a good grip on Hegel's views, and only then, as a secondary undertaking, you can begin to think about how Hegel's views are related to two other deep and important philosophers, namely Hegel and Brandom. But that is not, in the first instance, your job. And that's the way I would urge that you think about things. There's a philosophical view put forward in A Spirit of Trust. It is avowedly and evidently related to the words Hegel wrote in his manuscript. I'll say parenthetically, we now know that the number of hours he spent writing it was only a third more than is required to copy it out longhand. He really just sat down in a white hot fury and wrote it. Well, there are evident relations insisted on between the text of A Spirit of Trust and what gets boiled down in the lectures and the handouts on the one hand, and Hegel's text on the other. And there are similar connections with making it explicit and Brandom's views in philosophy of language. Those are interesting things to think about, but first try and figure out what the philosophical view that is on display here, that Brandom is attributing to Hegel. So this is a somewhat peculiar, maybe idiosyncratic aim for the course, but I claim it will pay some advantages. It will have some advantages and pay some dividends. So that's a word about sort of how to work efficiently. Ideally, you'd be reading everything in both books, or anyway, everything I've assigned in the course, but you can skip a bit with, or save a bit by looking at the lectures or the handouts on the Spirit of Trust side. For the translations, I think the Inwood translation of the Phenomenology is the best one. The Miller is not bad. I use the Miller paragraph numbers, so does Inwood, for references. So you ought to have one or the other of those around. The other one who uses the Miller paragraph numbers is Pinkard. I don't recommend that translation, but yeah, that would be my preference. For other things, if you want to look at a good, safe, close to the text de dicto reading, Jean Hippolyte's Genesis and Structure of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is a good one. And Pinkard's Hegel's Phenomenology, the Sociality of Reason, is a good account. It sort of goes one move deep, but sometimes it's better to only have the one move deep. as sort of background reading, Pinkard's Hegel, a biography, will tell you all sorts of neat stories about Hegel. And for fun, but maybe more than that, I've linked to a text of the first great commentary on the Phenomenology, which is Thomas Carlyle's book, Sartor Resartus, which is a parody of the Phenomenology. Sartor Resartus means the tailor reclothed, and it's an extended philosophical meditation on the saying, the clothes make the man. The idea that we are social beings, and the outward visible sign of our social being is the clothes we wear. It's a parody of Professor Teufelsdroch from the University of Weissnichtwo, the University of, I don't know where it is, which he wrote in, Carlyle wrote this in 1836, so just 6 years after Hegel's death, only 30 years after he wrote the Phenomenology. I should say in this connection, it's a daunting thought to me that when Hegel was my age, he'd been dead for 10 years. He left Berlin to escape the cholera epidemic and spent 3 months out in the country. And then everybody told him the epidemic was over, and he came back to Berlin and it wasn't over, and he died. But Carlyle wrote what I think has a lot of good philosophy in it, is certainly an amusing commentary on Hegel, but I think also, is a penetrating reading of it, even though it's done in this mock mode. So anyway, that's something that you can dip into or out of when you've been reading Hegel for a while, and maybe be amused. I've also put, I showed you the image of the kind of hermeneutics I didn't want to think of myself as practicing. Here's the image of the one that I would like to think of myself as practicing. When I showed this to John McDowell, he greatly appreciated the picture, but he said, Bob, you should be careful about endorsing this as a picture of what you're doing, because what the guy is doing is literally insane. And so you better hope that that's not what it is. But I put those pictures in for this week, just for the amusement value of them. So I hope you've gotten some picture of the idiosyncratic course that's on offer here. As I say, next week, still not asking you to actually read any Hegel for next week, though no bad thing to get a head start on it. But I'm going to try and give an overview of the Hegel reading, the view that I find in Hegel, so that as we go through particular, as we start reading the introduction and to the book, Hegel's preface, like most prefaces, was written afterwards, and I think should be read afterwards. Reading the introduction, that you have some sense of the overall shape of the reading, of what the philosophical position that I think Hegel is putting forward is, into which each of the bits then will fit as we go along. So everything you want and need and more should be on the website. I mentioned there is no need to buy a copy of my book unless you want the physical object. If you email Dan, he'll facilitate your getting a PDF of it if you can't use the myriad sources that there are for such things out there. Okay. Any bookkeeping issues that I haven't addressed here? Okay. Well, it should be a trip. And look, I understand nobody's going to read all the things that I'm putting in there. Do what you can and get what you will from it. But the website is meant to be a rich resource, richer than you can fully exploit within a single term. But that's no bad thing. Okay. Well, then I will see you next week.
Thank you.